Hey, beautiful people, it's Alex Dalliance, and today we're going to work on if you want to make your microphone sound a lot better on Twitch or Zoom or any sort of voiceover work, anything like that, how to make it sound clear and powerful and resonant and everything and polished, everything a professional wants it to sound like. I had a friend reach out to me. He does a lot of voiceover work, but he does it in an environment that's controlled, and now during the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic quarantine, he wants to get in to be able to do this sort of thing from his home, and but he's not an audio engineer, and there's a lot of tricks that go into this that could take a very cheap but decent mic and make it sound amazing, or if you have an amazing mic like this Earthworks SR40V, then it'll sound even more amazing. So before we get started, I just want to sell out real quick and talk about Vulture Culture merch. So if you find these videos helpful, one of the best things you can do is actually to just buy some merch for my band Vulture Culture, like this One Seriously Perverted Bitch mug, which is a song off of my first album. Everybody knows that coffee tastes better out of a seriously perverted coffee mug. So let's begin. First off, I'm going to be using Reaper. You could be using anything you want, but if you use Reaper, you can get this exact vocal chain, effects chain, in the download link. The good thing about Reaper is it's free to use during the coronavirus pandemic, which is amazing. And the other thing that's really great about this is that the plugins are always free. So you can go to the Reaper website and get these plugins and use them on their own. The exact vocal chain won't be that useful for you unless you're using the exact mic that he's using and have his exact voice, but it's going to give you the basics idea of what we're trying to do with a vocal tone, how we're going to take it from sounding kind of to sounding really good. What we're going to do is we're going to start by just listening to what he sounds like speaking into his mic, and with no processing whatsoever.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s, when physicists realized that there are very close ties between two of the four fundamental forces. Namely,
all right, so it actually sounds really good. The type of microphone that he's using is a Sennheiser MKH 416-P48U3, which is a tube microphone, a short shotgun tube mic that costs about $1,000. I'm sure it's an amazing microphone. He got it as someone told him to get it. I don't know why you would spend this kind of money on a microphone for doing voiceover work. Shotgun mics are really, really useful for if you're in a live situation, which maybe that's what he got it for, is for more of that type of a thing. Because what they do is they funnel noise out from the sides. And so whatever the microphone is pointed at, and you can even hear on this mic how as I move away, it stops, unless I'm speaking directly into it. It's actually pretty directional too. But a shotgun mic, even more so. And that doesn't really seem to make all the most sense if you're just in a room like this. So I'll put a link to what I would recommend. But his mic will be fine for him. The biggest takeaway here is you really don't need an amazing mic. You just need an okay mic, and that will get you far enough. So I'll put some links into what I would recommend in the description. So the first thing I'm noticing here is if I expand this out a little bit, you can see pretty clearly that he is clipping. I believe he is clipping. We'll look at the waveform here and see if he is. That looks like a clip. That's definitely clipped there. Okay, so what that means is what he should do is actually turn the knob down on his interface. Another question he had for me was, does the interface that you use matter? And the short answer is not really. As long as you're using a decent one. He's using an Audient ID4, which is a $200 amazing audio interface. I would recommend it. I actually was looking into buying one of these recently. Really great, incredible sounding preamps, but you don't even need that. I mean, if you're using a Focusrite Scarlett or Presonus, but basically any of the ones that are on Amazon in the $150 range should be more than enough of what you need. But the biggest thing is you don't want to clip when you're recording. So right here, there is information lost that we can never get back. So that's the biggest thing, is you want to make sure that your waveform is never peaking. So that's the number one trick right out of the box. He was asking, is there any way, do I need to like use a program to enhance my, and no, you don't need to. You just need to make sure you don't clip on the way in. Having said that, I have a feeling like if we listen to this, let's turn snapping off real quick.
As the universe cooled, and
it's really not that big of a deal. Like, I don't think by the time we're done compressing this, it'll be really too big of an issue. But just for the sake of, like, you know, I feel like I need to say this sort of thing. If this was worse, like there were more clipped peaks, it would sound distorted, and there's not a lot we can do to fix that. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do to make this sound really good, and we really don't seem to need it. I mean, it's actually incredible how clean of an environment he was able to record this in. So you can see barely any noise here, but if we just loop, like let's say we just loop right here, and we turn this up, we can hear a little bit of room noise. Not very much though. I mean, it's pretty incredible how little noise that's picking up. It might have to do with the fact that it's a shotgun. So it's rejecting mostly everything that's not on axis with the microphone. So we're going to open up, and I'm also, by the way, I think I mentioned this, but all the plugins I'm going to use are built into Reaper. They're also free. So we're going to start with the Kakos designed RIA gate, and we're going to get a RIA Q and a RIA comp, and we'll load all of those at once right now so we don't have to keep going back and forth. But we're going to put the gate first, and I'll turn the compressor and the EQ off. And what we're going to do is I'll loop that section of noise again real quick. And what we just want to do is we want to make sure that we remove the noise from the signal. And this, again, is much more useful in a live situation than, I mean, in this case, his room is so clean, it's really not a big deal. But just so you can hear it real quick, we'll turn it way up again so everybody can hear. Okay, so when we're looping this, you can see that at minus 105 decibels to full stop, which would be as loud as something could possibly be, we're below where the little green indicators are there. And what that's telling us is that that's below the noise floor of his room. So his noise floor is somewhere around 80 decibels. And so right now it's letting all the audio through. You can hear it. As soon as I move it above that, it'll not let any audio through. And so that's the first thing you want to do with any signal, is to make sure that you are successfully removing that. Now, you don't want to go too high here. So if I go to his voice here and we just move forward, you'll see that I'm above his voice here, and so it's not letting it through. So we want something between -6 and 100 decibels as a threshold. So if I bring this down,
the four fundamental forces, namely the weak force and the electromagnetic force.
So now you can hear that we are listening to where it's letting it through, but it's a little unnatural. So I'm going to try to find kind of a quiet spot here in the waveform. So he got louder. I asked him to move closer and closer to the mic as he did, because one of the problems with, if you set a compressor setting or something, but it's not the way you're going to sound in a live situation. So you want a compressor to be able to grab the signal as you move away and as you move close, and hopefully it doesn't get too bad, because when we're recording, depending, you might not realize, like if you're reading from a page, that as you get to the bottom of the page, you might slowly move your mouth away because you're trying to get to that. And then when you get to the top, you move over again, that type of thing. So we want to be able to correct for that with our plugin. So we'll start in the beginning and make sure that we're getting every bit of this vocal is getting through what we care about.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s.
See how if I have it too high,
very close ties,
we get this really unnatural chopping.
Forces, namely the weak force and the electromagnetic force.
Okay, so what we can do to fix this would be, first off, I'm going to increase the release here from the default of 100 milliseconds to about 250.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s.
And that's already helping. And what that does is that's just extending how long the plugin goes before it launches down. Another thing we can do is use hysteresis. So what hysteresis means is that the threshold is the trigger for the gate opening and allowing audio through. So you have to be above the threshold and the gate will open. But we can change the value of when the gate closes by adding or subtracting hysteresis. I know it's a technical word, but all it really means is that the threshold for closing is different than opening. So let's play around with that real quick.
A major breakthrough in particle physics.
I'm going to bring this up even a little higher so we can make it a little more obvious.
A major breakthrough in particle physics.
I want it to sound bad just for to illustrate this.
Realize that there are very close ties between the four fundamental forces.
So you notice that, okay, so now that I've lowered the hysteresis, once the gate is open, it takes an additional 7.8 decibels lower than the initial threshold. So that would be whatever 16.4 minus 7.8 would be, right? So if I make this, we'll make this easy on my pathetic brain. We'll make it just -7 for a second, or let's make it 8 just to make it easy. So instead of -16, it'll be -24.4 would be the closing threshold. So we can listen to how this sounds.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s.
So we're still losing some because we didn't really set our threshold correctly in the first place. But hysteresis is very useful to help avoid that choppiness because a lot of the times, obviously, people start a vocal passage with more breath in their lungs. And then when they get to the end, if they forgot to breathe, they start to get a little quieter. So we want to be able to kind of correct for that a little bit. I found that, 5 decibels is usually more than enough. What we'll do is we'll actually set the threshold correctly first. It doesn't need to be anywhere near this high.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s when physicists realized that there are very close ties between two of the four fundamental forces, namely the weak
So
force.
-35 seems fine. Again, his noise floor is close to 80, which is incredible. So we could actually set this much lower. And if when you're going through this, if it ends up being where you find, hey, I don't really, you might as well set it lower if you can. The downside of that is if I'm doing a passage and say a car drives by, speeds by my house or something, it might not get caught because it'll be masked by my voice on the recording. But if the gate is open, then that will go through. So anyways, we'll leave it at 250 release. I like that. We're going to add some negative hysteresis, and -35 decibels seems to be great for his setting, but obviously you just want to set this to taste. You want to make sure that you are not cutting off even the quietest words. Depending on your situation, you can do that. All right, the next step is we're going to EQ this, this vocal, and this is where most of the magic will happen. So we're going to open up re-EQ really wide, or maybe I'll move it so that you guys, it's not running over my face cam here.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s when physicists realized that there are very close ties between two of the four fundamental forces.
So you can see that this microphone has a lot of peakiness around 2K here, and then quite a lot of body all through 500, like these lower mids to the low frequencies. So the first thing I always do with microphones is high pass them. So all I have to do is grab this shelf and drag it down, and it'll turn into a high pass filter. Somewhere around 80 to all the way up to, say, something like 200, which I know sounds intense, but it actually is a usable thing depending on the microphone. So
a major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s when physicists realized that there are very close ties between two of the four fundamental forces, namely the weak force.
It's not doing very much,
magnetic force,
which is fine. So we can even bring it up to, we'll even bring it up to 100. My guess is this microphone might have a built-in high-pass filter to avoid rumble and plosives, which is what happens when you make a sound into a microphone. A P, Bs can sometimes create that plosive thing, which will create a lot of energy that's really low. In obviously, it's like a bassy frequency that you're creating there. So many microphones used for field work, like a shotgun mic, will have a high pass filter built in because they know, hey, we don't need these frequencies. We never will. Now, another thing that we're going to do is we're going to move towards the end here to where he's really loud and really close to the microphone. And we're going to create another we're going to create a low shelf. So I've gone over this in my Fundamentals of EQ series, which is, you can find a link for that in the description too. But shelves work by moving all the frequencies above or below a given frequency. Unlike a band or bell EQ that moves frequencies around a point, so in this case around 1K, but nothing above a certain point either. So what we want to do is we want to use a low shelf, which will move all the frequencies above or below, and we want to account for the proximity effect. So the proximity effect, if you're not familiar, is the closer or further you get away from a microphone, the bassier it sounds relative to the rest of the mix. And it's around 200, and then it sharply increases. So as I move away, even if you're starting to hear more of the reverb of my room here, but even if I'm way back here, you can still hear my voice at around the same level because I'm speaking as closely as I can directly into the mic, and the compressor is bringing up the volume. But it's a lot thinner sounding than as I move closer and closer and closer to where I'm really up on the microphone. Now we have a lot of bass boost, right? And that's a physics problem. It's not mics, depending on the microphone, and it's actually much less with a microphone like this, because this handheld vocal mic for singing is designed to compensate for the proximity effect as best as it can. So anyways, that's around 200 hertz or 200 cycles, the frequency 200. And we're going to try to remove some of that as he gets really close, because we don't need that.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang.
Well, that's amazing how much you can bring out.
As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level, an invisible force field called the Higgs field was formed together with the associated Higgs boson. A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s when physicists realized that there are very close
Okay, so that actually did an incredible amount to get our vocal sounding right in the ballpark. So one of the biggest things is microphones are often designed to be pretty flat at a certain distance. Mine is supposed to be about 6 inches. And that's different for every microphone. You can look up that number. It's very important that you know the number it's designed to be flat at, because that's kind of where you want to be most of the time. But in general, what we're looking to do is get for me, what I like from a vocal tone is a very flat sounding tone. In the case of, depending on what the application is, you might want to change that. And we're going to actually build in a few ways that you can change that depending to add or subtract certain frequencies. But this right now is a pretty good proximity boost compensation. So we'll listen again.
We know from experiments that this is not true.
Okay, so immediately there's like there's a frequency in here that's like very boxy, like we're listening in through like that. That's usually an indicator of something around the 500 hertz range. That's just my guess. So we're going to what I'm going to do is actually narrow this band width so it's really sharp instead of wide, so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to bring it down to pretty narrow, and then I'm going to try to find that frequency. I can almost guarantee it's 1K to 300 or somewhere in there is going to be the frequency we're looking for. So I'm just going to try to make it sound really bad. Then we'll go back to normal, get our ears acquainted to that, and then we'll bring that frequency out. So
we know from experiments that this is not true.
Okay, that's pretty bad.
So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. So somewhere in that
300 frequency range actually
cooled and the
makes his voice sound pretty good. So yeah, it's definitely around 500. So what we'll do is we'll just listen to the passage again to reacclimate our ears to those frequencies.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass.
So what's so advantageous about ducking a frequency out anywhere in the mids? So that's like from the 300 to 2K is kind of the upper mids. frequencies is what we've done is we've still retained some of the bass content. So his voice is going to sound powerful and masculine and authoritative. But we've cut out all of that mud that was in the middle there so we can have a clearer tone. And you'll notice I haven't added anything yet. There's a bunch of reasons why subtractive EQ is maybe the way you want to go instead of boosting. At least at first, we'll get to where we'll boost, but this can be useful.
We know from experiments that this is not true.
I still feel like I could actually even pull out more now that I'm listening to it. I can hear there's a resonanced note in there.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
Okay, so it's actually, just with a couple of moves here, we've got a really great vocal tone. We don't have to do a whole lot else, honestly. What we're going to do is we're going to grab the high shelf and we're going to bring the bandwidth down. So you can see, and again, if you want to know more about how EQ works, I did an entire series on this. But by shifting the bandwidth to narrower, instead of the shelf being more of like a slope, now we get a shelf actually, and that's where the name comes from, like a bookshelf. Yeah, because you can see that it's actually flat above. And that's because if we boost with more of this type of a shelf, all of the frequencies above 10K, pretty much no matter where we go, are going to get boosted a lot. For a microphone that's going to be used in a, if this was a vocal for a song, I wouldn't be too afraid of that because I love really airy, bright, I love the breathiness of a vocal. But for this, we don't want that at all. One major difference is spoken word formats are more about intelligibility, which are going to be making sure that mid-range comes through strongly, and it's not about sibilance. It's not about airiness. So we're going to listen to this again without doing anything here real quick.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution.
What's really nice about this microphone is it has a pretty steep drop-off above those intelligibility frequencies. You can see the information.
We know from experiments that this is
substantially
not true.
lower above 5K, which is about, you don't need anything above 5K, not much here. And it would still be very intelligible. So what we want to do is we want to add some amount of mid-range boost, and we're going to try to figure it out by just listening.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass.
What I'm looking at is, and I'm trying to EQ by ear, but the great thing about this is we can actually see it very clearly. Normally it can't. Normally EQ plots are just kind of messy. But above 2K, there's definitely a dip.
We know from experiments that
you can see there's a peak around here. So what I want to do is I want to get above. So I'm probably going to bring this around here so we can start to bring up some of the energy to correct for that.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
So that sounds a lot better. We're starting to introduce a lot of sibilance that we're going to need to remove. But that actually sounds pretty good. Something like that. What I'm going to do is I'll add another band.
We know from experiments
and we're going to take out a little bit of... There's obviously a bad frequency somewhere in here, so I think...
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout...
Okay, so that sounds pretty good. What we're going to do now is just... So that was just kind of correcting for that peak here. We're going to take another band, and we're going to turn it into a high shelf instead of it being a band. And we're going to take out frequencies above 5K. So if I bring it, I might do 10K, we'll see, because you can see that even though I'm bringing down frequencies above 10K, it's affecting the frequencies below. So maybe 10K is a better frequency. We'll just figure it out as we go.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level.
All right, so incredibly, we're taking out 10 decibels up around 10K with this shelf. And that sounds a little dark to my ears, but I want to get rid of the sibilance. We don't need it for what we're talking about, which is spoken word. My mic is actually set, I use the same settings because I'm lazy for my vocal, for when I'm singing. But you don't really need a lot of the frequencies that are way up here. This isn't really all that useful for when you're doing something where you want to be sure you're audible or understandable.
We know from experiments that this is not true.
So that's too dark.
Physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level, an invisible force field called the Higgs field was formed together.
So that's probably pretty good. That's tamed it pretty well. Once we apply a de-esser at the end, that'll be useful. Okay, so this is kind of my basic. I think that's in the ballpark for how his voice should sound. We'll check it from the beginning.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s.
Wow, you can really hear the proximity effect difference where he sounds so much thinner over here than he does here.
They suggested that all particles had no mass. Physics came in the 1970s when physicists of the Standard Model, the electroweak force. But in order for this
okay, so this is interesting. So we're going to add another re-EQ, and I'm going to hit F2, which allows you to rename it. And we're going to call this bass boost. All right, and we're going to change the low shelf to a flat shelf, and we'll add some bass back in here in the beginning.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s when physicists realized that there are very close ties between two of the four fundamental forces.
All right, so you could boost up to about 5 decibels would be about what you need to be able to add the ass back into this sound. Now, up here, I think it's probably going to be way too much.
The solution to solve this conundrum.
Right, I mean, it's just really not great. So the one thing I would say to my friend who asked me to do this video is be aware of your distance with this microphone and take into consideration. I think it's probably better to be further back, and then you have to do less aggressive EQ. Because once you're up here, you're definitely, A, you're clipping, and B, it's getting much muddier. And you can just hear it sounds distorted without anything.
The solution to solve this conundrum.
More distorted anyways is what I mean to say.
Very close ties between two of the four fundamental forces.
That's like an audiobook tone right there.
Force and the
So anyways, what I'm going to do is I'll remove these other bands. So we only have one band. And we have, so all this is a bass corrector at around 500. And that'll just boost the low end. In this case, I'll leave it pretty subtle at about a 1 decibel boost to correct for that. Again, it's just all to taste. This is going to be in the chain so that you can use this chain and adjust how you feel fit, how it fits your tone.
A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s when physicists realized that Robert Brout and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass.
All right, just a little bit of a boost. Because remember when we were EQing, 300 sounded like a really good frequency for increasing the commanding nature of his voice. So we'll leave that there. And what we'll do is we'll add another EQ. And what this EQ will be is the exact same idea. We're going to remove everything except for the high shelf. We'll flatten it. And I'm going to say like a 2K, around a 2K boost. Maybe we'll see.
Robert Brout and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level.
So yeah, I'm going to actually put it around 1K. That way it peaks around 2K. 2K is sort of the magic frequency when it comes to vocals or basically anything. It's where, if you look at what's called a Fletcher-Munson curve, which is where they've studied where ear sensitivities are across the frequency spectrum, around 2K is where we start to get extremely sensitive. So that is the annoying frequency, and it's also the presence frequency. So if you want something to stand out, you want more 2K, and if it sounds annoying to your ears, you want less. So that's what I would use as sort of my guideline here. So we're going to reset that and we'll maybe add a little bit.
Robert Brout and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
We don't need a lot because we've got a lot from our previous EQ moves, but we're going to put just a little bit in.
Robert Brout and Francois Englert.
I can really hear it, maybe even less. It's really, we were pretty close before.
Robert Brout and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
Yeah, so we'll put a little bit in. And then the same thing, I'm going to rename this by hitting F2. Okay, so we're going to call it Presence Boost. All right, so now we have these two shelves that allow you to sort of, control. So if if it sounds a little too annoying, you can take it out.
Robert Brout and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level, an invisible force field called the Higgs field was formed together.
Just a little bit seems okay, and the same thing with, the bass boost. So these will be there in the settings. That way you can, without having to mess with this more complicated EQ curve, you can just add or subtract bass as you need it, or you can add or subtract those presence frequencies as you need it. Let's get to compression. The biggest difference between a polished vocal tone and a bad vocal tone, or just an unprofessional sounding vocal tone, will be in the compression. So what we want to do is, we'll start from the beginning, go through very quickly some of the basics about compression. I've set up my compressor to have a few defaults that are different than the standard Reaper defaults. The standard Reaper default sets the attack to 3 milliseconds. We're going to change that to 0. The attack is how long it takes for the compressor to clamp down on the signal. The goal of a compressor is to squash the signal, effectively making it quieter, but then you boost the signal up in volume using makeup gain. And what that does is it means that when he's speaking quietly, it doesn't come across too quietly. And when he's really loud, it's not too loud. That's all we're trying to do here. And that's huge when it comes to making a vocal tone sound really good. So the attack is how quickly it grabs, and release is how quickly it lets go. And what you more or less want for almost any vocal application is lightning fast attack most of the time, and release as fast as you can go without causing distortion. So this compressor, the one that's built into Reaper, can actually act as a clipper, which is just pure distortion. So if I set them both to 0,
we know from experiments that this is not true.
And we bring it down, you can hear how quickly we can get distortion.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and
so we could get a really distorted tone.
The solution to solve this conundrum.
It sounds like he's like a special effect. So what we'll do is, instead of that, we're going to actually increase the release.
We know from experiments that this is not true.
To remove distortion.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution.
So somewhere around 100 milliseconds is in fact about as close as you want to be able to get with the release, where it has room to breathe. Now, if you increase it too far, which is, I think, the common mistake when you're learning how to compress vocals, it gets very unnatural sounding because you can hear the pumping of the compressor is so slow that it becomes hard to, it's no longer compressing with great fidelity.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve.
You can see with this meter here, it's just kind of doing.
They suggested that all particles had no mass.
It's bouncing back very slowly. So 100 milliseconds seems to be good. 0 milliseconds seems to be good for the attack. If for some reason we could play with this, sometimes it can be advantageous, given the vocalist you're working with and how they sound, to add some plosive back in.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
But I don't think we need that for this. There's an auto release switch in Reaper's compressor. It doesn't do a lot in this compressor, but we'll put it on. What an auto release does is it looks at the signal and it tries to tighten the release based on the frequency content or the signal content. It depends on the compressor. And that way you can just get even better release, tighter release than you could get with just a fixed setting. Again, it doesn't really do too much here. Now we're going to look at the ratio. So ratio is what affects the how much compression is occurring at what threshold. So we'll see how these react to each other in a second. So with a 1-to-1 ratio,
we know from experiments that this is not true.
There's no compression happening at all.
Robert Brout and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
So the threshold, what the threshold is going to do is that's the frequency which it's the opposite of a gate, where above that threshold, the compressor will start to kick in. And so if you want to just shave off, if we wanted to get everything to be about the volume of, say, this passage right here where it's really quiet, we could set the threshold to just around there.
Two of the four fundamental forces.
So around 23.5, that's where those, where his signal is. And we don't really need to compress more than that because that's a good low end view. Now, as we apply more of a ratio, let's say to where he's speaking louder,
particles had no mass just after the Big Bang.
As we increase this, you'll see that the compression starts to kick in. And what it's doing is, say if we're at a setting of 8-to-1, that means for every 8 decibels above negative 23.5 that his voice goes, it will only raise 1 decibel. So we're chopping off 7 decibels. We're crushing 7 decibels of signal down. So let's hear how that sounds.
Particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe
and you can see the gain reduction meter coming in.
A critical level, an invisible force field called the Higgs field was formed together with the associated Higgs boson. A major breakthrough in
at infinity to 1, what it's doing is it's not letting anything past that frequency. But we don't really need to crush it that hard. We just need to, because that'll be unnatural. So there's a few settings that are commonly used with vocals: 2-to-1, 4-to-1, 6-to-1, 8-to-1, and 20-to-1. And those are based off of a lot of times what the settings were in analog gear. Feel free to play around with them, but usually one of those settings will work fine.
Particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level, an invisible force field called the Higgs field was formed together with the associated Higgs boson.
So we can hear pretty quickly, actually, that that's doing quite a bit of compression around negative 6 decibels. So if we go back to where it was quiet.
Namely, the weak force and the electromagnetic force.
We're still getting quite a bit of compression, actually.
Described within the same theory, which forms the basis of the standard model.
It actually sounds pretty good. We could try 4-to-1, but increasing the threshold because it'll probably sound crushed like this because we're already getting a lot of gain reduction.
So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
Let's see how it sounds if we use 3 milliseconds of attack.
Had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level, an invisible force field called the Higgs field was formed together with the associated Higgs boson. A major breakthrough in particle physics came in the 1970s.
You can hear that we are getting some distortion, so we'll add a little bit in.
Fundamental forces, namely the weak force and the electromagnetic
We'll leave it at the
force.
standard settings. They actually sound really good.
Forces can be described within the same theory, which forms the basis of the standard model.
And you'll notice that we've by adding the attack back in, we've substantially removed how much gain reduction is happening, and that's because it's not clamping down on everything so far. So let's add a little bit more compression. I know it sounds like a lot, and when you're not used to the sound of compression, it can sound like, wow, this is really extreme. But that's just how, like, if I turn the compression off on my microphone right now, it would sound very different. So if I turn this off, listen to how different my microphone sounds right now. Obviously, there's a lot of gain being added, but to make the point there, right? Like, it really does change the sound quite dramatically.
So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level, an invisible force field.
All right, so one thing that's occurring to me is that as he's approaching being very loud, the distortion here is hard to separate from the distortion of the actual microphone. This microphone does a very good job of retaining clarity all the way up because that's what it was designed for. I'm sure the shotgun mic is a great microphone. It's a $1,000 microphone. I mean, it better be great, but you should just be further away from that. I asked him to do this though, so it's not on him, but it's, this is clearly a microphone that sounds better when you're a little bit further away. And because his noise floor is so low anyways, there's no reason not to record back here. So I'm going to move away from this segment and just, with the caveat, don't get too close to the mic.
Within the same theory, which forms the basis of the standard model. This unification implies that electricity, magnetism, light, and some types of radioactivity.
So that sounds pretty good. But because we've chopped so much of the signal away, we actually need to add some. So there's a nice fader here that lets us add volume back in.
Within the same theory, which forms the basis of the standard model. This unification implies that electricity, magnetism, light, and some types of radioactivity are all manifestations.
So we'll just leave it at +6, since that seems to be about where the gain reduction is hovering, and we can always just turn his microphone up here.
Within the same theory, which forms the basis of the standard model.
I want to make sure that when we get to the loudest part where he was clipping here, that we're not clipping the output here.
As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level,
we're still
an invisible force field called
-6,
the
which is a
Higgs
great
field
place to
was formed
be.
together with the associated Higgs boson. A major
Now,
breakthrough.
some interesting things are starting to occur. As you apply compression, it'll change the tonal balance because the compressor is reacting to what you're feeding it. Oh, I could definitely hear a pop there.
Big bang. As the universe cooled
See,
and the
there's
temperature...
definitely an aggressive pop, so we need to clamp the attack down a little more.
Big bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell...
we got to make the compromise there and add a little bit of distortion to remove those really horrible plosives. I shouldn't say horrible. I'm not saying your voice is horrible. It's just the nature of what goes into doing this. So now that we've made this bass and presence boost, we're going to play with these.
This unification implies that electricity, magnetism, light, and some types of radioactivity are all manifestations of a single underlying force called, unsurprisingly, the electroweak force.
Yeah, so somewhere around there, and maybe we'll play with this frequency too.
This unification implies that electricity, magnetism, light, and some types of radioactivity are all manifestations.
So I actually like more of the presence boost now that we're feeding it into the compressor. And as a general rule, you want to go gate, EQ, compressor. The reason for that is that you want to compress the peaks generated by the EQ. EQs, most of the time you're going to be thinning out vocals because we need to record vocals closely to avoid too much reverb from the room. And what that means, you'll get more proximity effects. So most of the time you're going to be thinning out vocals. And what that means is you can get sibilance from the vocals. So you want to compress that. If you EQ after the compressor, that is like a recipe for sibilance. So then the vocal's going to sound, there's going to be these really annoying sounds that get through the compressor that they're very fast. What we might do is actually bring this frequency down. I want to see what it sounds like if we bring it in really low.
This unification implies that electricity, magnetism, light...
I really want to get that area there, so I've changed my mind. We'll bring this down to 250, and we'll use some of that. I was getting too much of the low mids.
This unification implies that electricity, magnetism, light, and some types of radioactivity are all manifestations of a single underlying force called...
So that sounds really good because I wanted to add a little bit of the bass back into his voice to make sure that we don't get too thin sounding. You want a pretty you want a thinner sounding vocal than you think a lot of the times, because by the time you get done processing, again, it's all about intelligibility. But for radio applications and stuff, it's true that you do want to make sure that you retain the bass, because that's a lot of what people like in a speaking voice, is like a nice, deep, bassy voice. All right, so we're starting to get there. We're very close. What we're going to do is actually add a couple more plugins in the JS folder. So Reaper allows users to make their own plugins, and these are all free. Most of these come with Reaper, but on the Reaper website, there's also a whole section where you can find new plugins that people have made. There's a couple that are useful here. So I'm going to find the tilt equalizer. We're going to add that before the compressor. And we're going to search de-esser. Yes, we're going to add that after the compressor. This compressor de-esser was made by Lighton. He's an amazing plugin designer. These default settings are great. What a de-esser does is kind of what it sounds like. It removes the S sounds, the sibilance I was talking about from a voice. So this will be useful to correct for the presence boost and what we already kind of scooped out a bit of the 10K here. So we're going to listen back and we'll add a little bit in.
This unification implies. But in order for this unification to work mathematically, it requires that the force-carrying particles have no mass.
You could hear it on force. There was a little bit of an S, but I want to find a better...
We know from experiments that this is not true, so physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature fell below a critical level, an invisible force field called the Higgs field was formed together.
All right, so we're getting some gain reduction. We don't need much. I never find I need more than like -3. And what that did was that just helped remove those annoying frequencies. So what I'm actually going to do is go back into the original EQ and we'll actually brighten up a little bit because now we have something that's going to catch those S's. And that's what I was EQing out before. So we might be able to get a slightly brighter, more present vocal without getting those horrible S's because that is feeding through all of these processes into the de-esser. So in fact, what I'll do is I'll split the de-esser off here so we can see the gain reduction meter. And I'll pin it and we'll move it down here so you guys can see it. And then we'll go to the EQ and let's move it over here so you guys can see it. Yeah, and we'll see what the gain reduction looks like as we increase some of the frequencies here.
We know from experiments that
getting
this
like
is not
1.5 to
true.
3.
So physicist Peter Higgs,
Physicist
Robert
is a good
Brout,
one to
and
see
Francois Englert came up with. We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
Solution to solve. That's another. I don't, by the way, I just naturally don't have a very sibilant voice. I have a low, like I'm on the low end of, but there's nothing. I mean, sibilance is beautiful. Many people with beautiful, airy vocal, the throat creates these great, airy, breathy sounds. I have trouble with those sounds, so I'm a little jealous.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
I actually think it sounds great with no removing the EQ, nothing being scooped out at around 10K, which is awesome because that'll make the vocal sound even better and brighter and clearer and more beautiful. But you can see we're adding in some more gain reduction here.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicist Peter Higgs,
yeah, so now we're getting maybe like 4 decibels of gain reduction. And you can see this is effectively just a high frequency compressor, what it's doing. Where everything above 4K and the threshold of -55, we're 4-to-1 compressing all of those frequencies way up there. Okay, so now the tilt EQ is interesting. What the tilt EQ can do is as we increase or decrease the amount, what it's doing is it's taking 2 shelves, whoopsie daisy, and it is moving them in tandem. So bringing either a low shelf down and the high shelf up or vice versa. And we can hear what this sounds like pretty quickly.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicist Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
This will get deeper.
They suggested that all particles had no mass just after the Big Bang.
Now we're getting really bassy.
As the universe cooled and the temperature
now you'll notice that we're getting clipping.
Level.
So what we can do is we can just go to the gate here, and we're going to turn the wet signal down by, let's say, 5 decibels. The wet just means the output. You'll notice the dry is completely gone. It's because we don't need the unprocessed signal. Wet means processed, dry means not processed in audio lingo. So we lost 5 decibels of gain. All we really need to do is bring the threshold down by 5 here, because it's going to get 5 less, right? And then maybe we'll see, should be about the same now.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution.
That should be about identical to what we had before. So anyways, now what we can do is you can play with this. So once again, I'm putting this in the effects chain. I'm going to leave it off for now, but this is just a very quick way. Like if you're using this and you're recording yourself and you go, I sound a little dull. Well, then add very gently, because the tilt EQ is doing quite a lot, a little bit to the top end.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs,
or take some out.
Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
It's like, this is the FM late night radio DJ sound.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists
present,
Peter
but
Higgs,
a lot of bass. Or if you need something like more like an audiobook,
we know from experiments that this is not true.
You can add a decibel, and that sounds very, very, very bright. Not a lot of low end.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So
and then if you leave it off, it's somewhere in between.
Experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum.
Okay, so I think we've got a really great vocal tone here, and it's taken a little bit of technique, but I decided to go a little in depth in this video just to really give you guys all the tools you need to be able to make an incredible vocal tone. So hopefully we've been able to do that. Before I go, I'm going to answer a couple of questions that he asked me. Do I need a more powerful audio interface? No. Basically, any audio interface that they make nowadays is more than good enough. Coffee. Is more than good enough for what you need. How important is treating the room with audio panels and reflection items? Well, you can hear in my microphone quite a bit of reverb. Quite a bit. How important is it? Not that important. In my case, I do need some treatment because it is really boomy in here. But your noise floor is incredible. Like, you're not getting a lot of reverb with your tone. So you're good to go. I would not recommend you spend any money on acoustic treatment unless you just like the look of it or something like that. Can you make a mic sound better than it is? Yes, you can. We just did. I think we've made your mic go. But by the way, let's listen to the before and after here. This is without all of our effects.
We know from experiments that this is not true. So physicists Peter Higgs, Robert Brout, and Francois Englert came up with a solution to solve this conundrum. All particles had no mass just after the Big Bang. As the universe cooled and the temperature...
I think it sounds pretty good. So yes, you can make a microphone sound better. Difference between a condenser microphone and other types. So I went into kind of some detail about what a shotgun mic is. One way to show you actually what a condenser mic can do, or what it sounds like, is I actually have an SM58 here, which is a similar handheld vocal mic, but it's not a condenser. It's a dynamic mic, which is the other kind. All you really need to know about the difference is condensers are good for what you're doing. Your shotgun mic may be a condenser. Sounds like it is, but it might not be. It doesn't really matter. If you were to invest in another microphone, I would say make sure it's a condenser. Maybe something that looks more like this. This is a Sterling Audio ST59 Class A microphone, FET mic. I wouldn't recommend this one. It's not bad. There's just better options on the market. I use this microphone for years. It's great. So if you are in the market for a tube condenser microphone, a large diaphragm, as opposed to a small diaphragm like this microphone, I would recommend, instead of this Sterling Audio mic, I would recommend an Avantone CV12, $500 on Amazon. True tube microphone, sounds incredible. This is a Shure SM58 dynamic, and I'll show you just the difference of what it sounds like real quick. Okay, so we can hear the difference right away, right? I mean, there's actually a huge difference before we even begin, which is going to be just in volume. So a condenser can usually output a higher volume because it's a more sensitive microphone. The downside to condensers, by the way, is that they're much more prone to feedback. There's a lot of issues with condensers that might make them not the right choice, where you would want something like a dynamic microphone. The SM58 is the rock microphone all the way from, I don't know when it came out. It's a very old microphone, but it's still, lots of people love this microphone. I personally hate it, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some volume adjustment to this mic. We're just going to boost it up so it's kind of close to what it sounded like before. Listening to the difference between this mic and my SR40V, which is $1,000 microphone. This is like a $100 microphone. You can get different colors, but overall, if we had to say, I would say, hey, you know what? This isn't a bad vocal tone. And I'm not even changing the settings, not even the EQ settings from my other mic. So that says a lot. This has a lot of a honkier, it's just a very bad fit for my voice because I have a very deep voice and it doesn't output a lot. So then you need to compress it aggressively. I'm adding 20 extra decibels of gain to get it to sound like this. So, that's a big deal. 20 decibels is a lot of gain you have to add to put it in the ballpark of the output. So it's not bad to use a microphone like this. I just personally don't use it. So we're going to just swap this back over and listen to this. And I think it's pretty clear, the difference in the microphones and the clarity, the resolution, all of the things we care about. But what I would say is, if you have one of these lying around, that should not stop you from doing voice work, right? There's no reason that you can't use a microphone not designed for voice work whatsoever. You can still get pretty close. And, there's plenty of other mics that you could find that are more up your alley. All right, so let me see what the remaining questions were. Does the angle of the microphone impact things? Absolutely. The more of a cardioid shape, cardioid being like cardio, like a heart, that's the pickup pattern for a microphone. The more of that microphone's designed with that in mind, the more it matters. So I'm going to try to speak at the exact same voice volume. You can hear that I'm really disappearing to where I'm actually almost completely rejected, and you're really only hearing the reflections of my voice. You're only hearing the reverb of my voice back here. I wonder how far I can get before I start to pick back up again. Really not getting much. So if I go all the way back around. So yes, it makes a huge impact, the angle of the microphone. I found with this microphone, it does react to plosives with my voice a little bit more than I'd like it to. So a lot of the times I'll speak slightly off axis. So that's allowing the air from sounds like p to just move past the microphone very quickly. But I'm still getting basically full pickup. It's still getting all of my voice versus, here I can get a much more bassy tone, but I have to be very careful with my plosives because you could even hear that one. It was very loud. So, sometimes you might want a little bit of an angle. You might not always want to be forcing all the air directly into the microphone, but you don't want to be doing this type of thing where you're kind of like getting if you start getting out here, we're starting to really change the tone, which we EQ'd for earlier. Any other tips to make a mic sound better? The biggest thing is just play around with this, and use your ears. I think I've given everybody who's watched this video a pretty good introduction into what you need to know. I would say from here, you don't really have much else that I would ever recommend you guys worry about. You don't really need to know a whole lot else about audio. You don't need more plugins. This was all done with free plugins, right? If you're using Pro Tools, you're using Ableton, you're using Studio One, whatever, they all have EQs, compressors, and gates built into them, and they will be more than fine for what you need. You don't need to spend money on expensive plugins. It's a total waste of money, in my opinion. There is something to be said for spending enough money on a decent microphone. You'll see people saying like, the Yeti mic, the USB Yeti sucks and stuff like that. I haven't used that mic in particular, but I'm skeptical that you can't make it sound good. I think I demonstrated that the differences between these mics, between a $100 mic or maybe even less, I think sometimes they're like, I don't know, and $1,000, basically the best and most expensive handheld mic you can buy by the by Earthworks, which makes the most accurate microphones on the planet. So you've got that whole range, and you guys could hear that the difference probably doesn't make that much of a difference to the final product. It's something, it's different, but it's not that different. So that's always my goal, is to empower you guys to be able to make music or do vocal work, whatever you're doing, and do it right now and focus on making great work instead of spending a lot of money on gear and plugins and bullshit you don't need. So anyways, I'm Alex Dalliance. It's Vulture Culture. If you want to support me and you like this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and you can buy my merch. Link in the description. Love you. Bye.